I know this is the post-lunch session, but it's also a very exciting topic. So do feel free to use your apps to ask questions. And we also have a mic at the end. So feel free to raise your hand and ask some questions as we go through the next 28 minutes or so. So to kick things off, as I mentioned, Scope 3 emissions are really top of mind for most businesses today. So Dave, if you could start us off by defining the challenge and really talking a little bit about some of those buckets that Scope 3 emissions fall into.
Yeah, of course. And we always make fun of Scope 3, but I'm glad it's there because, frankly, that's why ESG has exploded so much because of the supply chain pressures to handle Scope 3. And some of the big buckets that we find, I work in manufacturing. We make software for manufacturers. The biggest one is purchased goods and services, which is upstream. So that's primarily in manufacturing. That would go all the way back to the cradle of the mine and then ultimately to the gate of your factory receiving dock. For most of our customers, that's by far the biggest contributor of their footprint, often between 80 and sometimes over 90%. And on the flip side of that would be customer use of your products in manufacturing, which for an energy-intensive product like a factory machine or a fossil-fueled vehicle, then that can be 99% of your scope. And then there's a whole bunch of other factors too, but those are the two most material ones in the manufacturing orgs that we work with.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, again, feel free to jump in if you have things to add. So anyone want to add to that?
Sure. I can tell you, I'm with McCormick, the king of spices, right? And most of these spices don't grow in Minnesota, or queen of spices, you know. They don't grow in, temperate areas. They're mostly in the global south. So here's the challenge. Our Scope 3 is 95.3% of our entire greenhouse gas emission.
We're at Estée Lauder, we're in a similar boat.
Exactly.
Did you want to finish?
Yeah,
or do you want to jump
sure. So, but the key here for us is most of those Scope 3 are things we don't control. They're out of our hands. Yep. And so you need to make sure you have a partnership with your suppliers. And one of the things we've done is to create what we call supplier leadership on climate transition. We partnered with PepsiCo and Mars, if somebody from there is here, to create this thing. We funded it. And this is not free gift. This is so that those suppliers, most of them small suppliers in packaging, Estée Lauder will be in that boat too, so that they can come together. We'll have a consulting company, Guidehouse, teach them about the climate so they can say strategies. But you know what is interesting? They didn't have a strategy, most of them, until we created this. We're in a 5th season now. And to me, that's the only way we're going to get to the end of Scope 3 solutions by 2030 and net zero by 2050.
Thank you.
Sorry, go ahead.
Just so on the positive side, first of all, thanks to The Economist for including us. And the couple of days content has been amazing. I think, on the positive side, one of the things that we're really seeing, obviously, in climate is we need structural solutions, right? So for companies, our structural solution is Scope 3. So it's also an opportunity in terms of how do we basically, and we're in the 95% range in terms of Scope 3. So what we've, similar to Mike and partnership, we've really tried to lean in with our suppliers. Our top 200 suppliers have registered their data at CDP. Our smaller providers, particularly our diverse suppliers, we've provided ESG climate education. Because the one thing we don't want to do, candidly, is leave our smaller buyers behind, who are traditionally the diverse suppliers. And what we found generally is, at least in our industry, it's really moving towards suppliers seeing climate as a competitive advantage and really investing in their own value chains.
I want to come back to that point because around competitive advantage, we also talk about lack of transparency, and sometimes that information can be held on because it's considered a competitive advantage. But I want to come back to that. But Diana, did you want to just quickly touch on?
Yeah. Actually, you're bringing up transparency, and Michael and Nancy have talked about stakeholder engagement and working together with other organizations, and I think that's a vital path forward if we're gonna really tackle our Scope 3 issues. And one of the efforts, we lead a lot of collaborative collaborative initiatives at BSR, bringing companies together, work on various initiatives. One of which is ASD, which is a collaboration on palm oil derivatives, of which Estee Lauder has been a longtime partner. And that's kind of the idea here, is to share transparently data on mills, mainly focused in Indonesia right now. But that's just a key example of, there's about, I think, over 20 organizations now that are part of this collaborative initiative, working on a very specific topic in a specific region to share data collectively to really help solve the problem.
Yeah. Dave, anything to add on?
Yeah, I mean, even probably the lowest level of sophistication anyway, and we'll peel down from there, is with our Scope 3 as a software provider, purchase goods, well, our Scope 3 is about 80% of our emissions. And about 70% of that is purchase goods and services, like data centers, lawyers, or whatever else. As a science-based target committed company, one of the first things that we do is we do a Pareto of our spend, as well as the global calculations of emissions for each categories of those spend, and then reach out to the suppliers. Are you committed, yes or no? Because if they are, if they're on a similar glide path as us, then they're not as much of a concern for us to meet our commitment. So sort of stage one of our analysis was to see which of our suppliers were aligned with us. And frankly, those are the phone calls that are driving the exponential increase in commitments.
Michael?
I think, Dave, you bring a very good point. This idea of science-based targets, setting science-based targets. What we're finding out is that some of these suppliers, not only do they not have a strategy, they don't really have a science-based plan to move forward. And when you look at what we've done, because of this convening of suppliers, some of them competitors, we pay for the training and the setting of the strategy. And it's helped us, because now I think we are one of the very, I hope many now, companies. We have our SBTI, Science-Based Target Initiative validation for our 2030 commitment, which is aligning on the 1.5 degree pre-industrial global warming temperature by 2030. And that was validated last year, because we started this journey in 2017. So we're a little bit cheating. We're a little bit ahead of most people. So we got that validated, and we've just submitted earlier this year our net zero plan for validation to the SBTI. So hopefully by the end of this year, be validated. But it is important to this point to have a science-based, and otherwise you can't measure. And what you can measure, you can't track.
What you can't measure, you can't manage. So,
Exactly.
Michael, it's not cheating, it's setting good example.
Exactly. Thank you.
And just to underline Michael's point, goals are very important.
Yes.
I know there's a big push against quote-unquote greenwashing.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, as Mike Bloomberg always says, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it.
Exactly.
And so in terms of data, the other piece I think that's so important is that we do have scopes 1 and 2, which keeps us humble, honestly, and we have to achieve net zero every single year.
Yeah.
But also, the data field, I think, has been a journey, and many of us, we're in the midst of converting from spend-based data to actual intensity data, which will dramatically change your numbers. So if you look at spend, for instance, we have a very high number around advertising, but when you actually look at the activity, this is likely to be lower. So a lot of this also requires, I think, a lot of trust, first of all, collaboration, but also trust and partnership really across the enterprise.
Yes. Your point around data is actually the way to get data is to build trust.
Absolutely.
To be able to collaborate. And I think that's kind of when we talk about engagement with your suppliers, bringing them into a room and having that discussion may work great, but only if they trust you. So how are you able to then convene a supplier network or conference or whatever to collect that data in a way that you can actually build trust and, I don't know, share learnings? Any examples?
Certainly, CDP has been a huge help. And we, as you probably know, we have 3 different categories. We have some categories like fragrance, actually, which we share with flavors and fragrances, which are very far ahead. So what we try and do is lean in on examples. Also, we have been assuring our climate scopes 1 and 2 data over the last couple of years. And again, very humbling. And we bring those, how is the data collected? What is the data? And where are the places where we can improve? Again, we bring those lessons to our suppliers. So I think it's more of a carrot than a stick, and also in many industries, the top players all share the top suppliers. So to the extent that you can either partner with the food industry or in our case, partner within fashion and beauty, they don't have multiple costs. They have one cost. And their cost is putting their data, in with CDP.
Dave, Nancy, examples? Dave?
Yeah, I mean, what Nancy was just talking about is some of the forward movers in gathering supplier-specific and product-specific data. You're literally blazing the ski trails. Like you said, when you go to a supplier and you make them do that for the first time, they cut the trees, they blaze the trails, and then some competitor of yours or someone else that uses the same commodity or same product, then it's there for them the next time. So there will be a time in the next few years where it should be smoother sailing when you're asking for supplier and product-specific data, but it's still tough today.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a great push to have more data, which is wonderful. We want more transparency, but we also, at the same time, have to understand that we have to know what to do with the data as well. And I think that sometimes that can get a little bit lost, but I think what many companies are doing now, and sometimes in partnership with other nonprofit institutions as well, are putting a lot of those learnings in public platforms and helping suppliers who might not have the sort of people power or understanding to know what to do with the information. So let's say they're performing their very first carbon footprint assessment. What next? What to do? The great thing is we're not in the place we were 5-10 years ago. Now we do know what to do. There's a lot of public resources available. And through webinars and different capacity building exercises a lot of organizations are doing with their suppliers, we're really trying to help educate and bring suppliers along rather than just saying, here's the red line, you either meet it or you're out, because that's also not responsible to our global society as well.
Yeah, and just to kind of turn to the audience also, if you have questions, feel free to raise your hand. We have a mic floating around, so I don't want to make this a let's leave questions till the end, so feel free to ask. But on that note around just being able to, make sure that everyone in the supply chain comes up together, are you seeing some of that with your suppliers, or have you seen examples where it's less of a I have to do it and more of a I know that this is going to have that brand positive effect and I want to be able to do it to be able to then, make sure that I'm the best supplier or whatever?
Yes.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Michael.
Yes. The bottom line is that there is a reality that we're in this together.
Yes.
This is, when it comes to climate, Johnny, that's what we're talking about. It's a pretty competitive space. If McCormick gets there alone by 2050 and be the only net zero company, we've all failed, okay? Because you can't encapsulate air or the climate. So the point is, when you make this case that this is a pretty competitive space, and we're in it together. And, for me, when I talk to them, I start with the African proverb that says, if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together. You're done. And most of them will say, amen, what do we need to do? So I believe that's the way to get people motivated to see the value in that.
Yes. Many of our suppliers are also publicly listed companies, so
Yeah.
that level of transparency needs to be there. There are, at this point, we don't have suppliers that are resistant to this. The question is, where are they on the journey? Also, as we get more data, particularly around intensity data, will enable our practitioners, whether it be our folks in our labs or our packaging experts, to make choices about packaging and about ingredients based on carbon intensity. So the more we're able to dimensionalize, no, we're not actually going to be able to use that, or we'll use it because it has XYZ properties. But looking, I think, at the total environmental social impact of your products, for those of us who are in CPG and in luxury, is critically important. And so it is definitely a journey. I agree with Diana. I think, honestly, sometimes we have too much software and not enough, really thinking through how do we use the data. And the bottom line is there's no magic bullet. For us, for instance, we have a transition report. You'll see for our SBTI, about 15% of our solutions we don't have yet. Right? And that means that our climate team has to sit with the SMEs in those individual departments and think through what could the solution be that would remove the most carbon. So to me, that's actually the most exciting piece of the work that we're doing, and really involves the most partnership. But again, data is important.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're finding a clutch point of the most material decision to be with the design engineers. Effectively, when they're selecting materials and selecting suppliers for the product that they're going to take to market. And you usually think of a OEM as their factory being the most footprint intensive. But in reality, OEMs, they don't build most of their parts. They just assemble the parts. So the vast majority of their footprint is from that decision that that mechanical engineer has to make. Like 80% of a product's footprint is decided in design, and the chosen suppliers are 90% of that. So it's an enormous job that they have. Historically, it's been done by mechanical engineers. But with modern products, they need to understand electrical engineering, software engineering, material science, all these things, because all this data is now finally coming together. And it's a plate of marbles to balance performance, cost, and footprint, those other things, which is where advanced analysis and more advanced collaboration tools are really helping out a lot.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting now to see, too, the design teams, the packaging teams, all being brought into the sustainability space. Before, the sustainability teams had been kind of associated with or seated within kind of compliance or within marketing, those kinds of things. And now you're seeing a lot of connections with the design folks as well. And as Nancy said, it's not just a one lever approach. You have to work with all different departments. And that's been really fascinating to see many of our member companies really trying to embed sustainability into all different functions, including procurement. Well, I just also want to touch on the one thing before, which is around how do we actually work with the suppliers to get there? And so I just want to touch on incentives for a second, because I think that's a primary lever of working with your procurement teams, business teams, on actually financially and also finding other ways to non-monetarily benefit.
If you could share examples, that would be great. I really
Yeah,
want
I
to be
mean,
able to understand.
on the financial side, and I'd be curious to hear my colleagues here talk about it as well, but longer payment terms, also lowering how long it takes to pay your suppliers. I mean, for the most part, it's not as if factories want to not pay their workers. They just don't have the capital. And so if you're not paying your suppliers for 180 days, I mean, that's going to cascade down. So just those are kind of ways. But if you don't have the financial incentives available to you, also finding ways to highlight your suppliers, potentially publishing them in your sustainability report or some ways to really provide recognition so that they see investing in sustainability as a business advantage for them.
We've been working, totally agree, around the sort of environmental footprint of a product being really in its infancy. So for us, about 80% of the environmental social impact of a product is in what we call NPL, new product launch. So what we've done, to Diana's point, is bring in the brand marketers and have them say, I want to make XYZ claim on XYZ product. And so we are then able, on a value side, to be able to go back to the supplier. So basically, the environmental team says that's possible or it's not possible. And then we go back to the supplier and say, what would need to be true in order for us to make this claim? Because again, I think we've seen, at least in the beauty industry, incredible consumer demand for transparency and incredible consumer demand for buying with their values. And so I think the other question is, what are the claims that you can make? How does the supplier's traits of that particular element create value-driving claims?
So no, I agree with you, Nancy. That's making claims has become a big lever for really driving sustainability. But I want to go to Diana's point about incentives, financing. Without financing, you're not going to get there. We recognize that. And you know what we did? We created with Citi and IFC. And I don't know if anybody from IFC is in the room here. IFC is part of the World Bank. And because we source from the Global South, that's where they play. And so we created what we call supply chain finance. And that supply chain finance is tied to our sustainability metrics. So if you're supplying something to McCormick, and if you don't meet what we call our Grown for Good, which is really a sustainable practice that addresses everything from carbon to product ingredients and quality and that kind of thing. If you don't get there, you don't get it. But in some cases, if you deliver on those things, you get not just paid quickly because of this partnership with IFC and Citibank, You get lower interest rate, if you know, and in some cases for smallholder farmers, no interest. And that is a big incentive. So what am I saying is the point that Diana was making is the financial institution have to be partners to this. Otherwise, you're not going to get there because you need to fund it in a different way from how we funded things before.
Dave, anything to add? I do want to talk a little bit about.
I think maybe some audience has questions.
Does anyone have questions?
Yes,
Please
standing
raise your
room only.
hand.
We're doing pretty well here.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Destiny, there you go.
Yes.
Oh, yikes. Hi, I'm Jeff Halper. I'm with Ryan Companies. I just have a question about, as your suppliers are continuing to make progress, starting to measure and then move forward, are your teams starting to make product and sourcing decisions based on sustainability profiles, or are you making decisions more based on, I think somebody said over there, and the glide path to get there? Or which way are you guys tending to lead?
Dave, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it depends upon the competition among the suppliers. Like I can tell you, some of our customers have called me and said, hey, we need this from you because we know that your competitors do this, this, this. So they can apply pressure on us for sure. But yeah, I would say it's typically more collaborative than that with most suppliers unless you have a commodity.
So to build on that point, in our own case, we don't have a choice. It's mixed right now, but before I get there, if you sell to Walmart, if you sell to Carrefour in France, like we do, we're a global company, you don't have a choice because they're putting that demand on us. And so if you're going to be a good supplier for us, you have to really enable us to deliver a sustainable product that they're asking for. That's a key feature. Is this, how do I put it? They say, the consumer is king, right? But these customers, these retailers, they hold the key to the kingdom. So if you want to really go to market through them, you got to make sure you comply. So that's what it is. But in terms of progress, it's a mixed bag because, this is a journey. This is not a marathon. This is a journey. So we're making progress, incremental progress.
I think the other thing to remember is that if you go down the stakeholder sort of line, you also have, you have employees and investors, and we are asked, basically we are at times asked by investors, what is your XYZ? And if you don't produce it, they can't invest in you. And we're, for instance, in several climate funds in Europe, and they give us targets. And we're able then to go back to our suppliers and say, this is the reality we're facing. The other is we have more and more consumers, particularly women and younger folks, being very specific about, I want to know the carbon imprint, I want to know what the environmental impact is, and we have the same with our retailers. Yep. And so we can then go back to our suppliers again in a dialogue and say, hey, what do you want from us? Yeah. This is where the business is going, you need to go there with us. So it's more of a, less of a, I need this, you got to do that, to, hey, let's face it, the world has changed. Yeah. And for our business, we really try and leverage our size. Our big competitors, which is great, are what we call indie brands, which are smaller brands who essentially often are making their product in their garage or their bathroom. So they know their supply chain and they're able to impact it. So we, again, try and think about how do we leverage our size, and that is really around bringing scale to some of the changes.
Yeah, I guess I will just say that when it comes to kind of supplier engagement on the sustainability front, you kind of bucket suppliers into suppliers that companies are already contracted with and engaging with. That's one thing. That's kind of hard to do once you have long-term contracts with your suppliers. It's actually a lot easier to do when you're in the RFP process and onboarding suppliers. So we are really talking to our member companies about how to integrate sustainability more actively into that onboarding process. In the supplier selection, and then even just, once they're onboarded as well. And so when we saw kind of in like procurement scorecards, when it first came up that sustainability was trying to get kind of integrated in there, was really small percentage. 5%, one or two questions. And now, and especially with the due diligence legislation, that's just continuing to expand. So absolutely, we're going to see more and more of that embedding sustainability requirements in the onboarding upfront process.
Audience questions. Yes, go ahead. Could we get the mic? Or, yeah, thank you.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, sorry.
Hi, everybody. Nadia El Andalusi. I work for Air Liquide. It's a French industrial gas company. I have one question on, so you said most of the scope 3 is coming from purchased goods and services. Very ambitious climate goal, getting, to net zero and everything. How are you onboarding your own organization? And I'm asking the question because, we're all like global companies, and there's sustainability people having this clear view about the ambition, and then how does it translate to the level where the suppliers are going to discuss with different type of procurement people? Are they all fully aware of the ambition? Are they incentivized to act on it at all levels? Because obviously there's the 80% suppliers, there's the smaller one that may be more advanced than the biggest one, I don't know. So how are you?
That's a great question. We often think of external stakeholders. What about our internal folks?
So how we started was this, we have a strategy which we call purpose-led performance. It simply means we committed to delivering top-tier financial performance. We're doing the right thing for our people, our communities, and the planet we share. So this is embedded in the business strategy. So every business unit around the globe has this. Your question, though, is pertinent because depending on the region, and I can tell you here, our head office is here in the US, outside of Baltimore. Europe is a little bit ahead of North America, so don't heckle me when I leave. But the bottom line is, because we're global companies, we're sharing best practices and making progress. That's the key. It's progress over perfection. That's what we're trying to do. But you make a very good point. Now, before now, we didn't have a way to say it. It's not embedded in the business. Now it is.
Yeah, we try and come at it from many different angles. We also have, we sort of live and breathe on strategy at our company. Yeah. So our strategy, a big chunk of it is devoted to really simplifying our climate strategy and teaching it into the business. In terms of the work itself, I have to say, I'm kind of fading in and out here. Hopefully I'm not personally fading in and out, just my voice. Is that we have found across the board that climate is the most important issue to our employees. Yeah. And we do surveys, always climate, and actually very much focused on buildings in particular. So we have teach in the strategy to everyone. We are trying to nail the data on intensity. Because if you create incentives, in my opinion, based on spend data, it's not actually fair. And so otherwise your marketing teams, your ad teams are going to have huge goals, whereas other teams like R&D might have lower goals. So we're in that journey. Once we set that intensity data, we will begin to set goals by department. And again, try and get it to the frontline decision makers. So it hasn't been, to my mind, a lack of people caring as employees. It's been more the availability of correct data to manage the decision making. Lastly, we have 80 sustainability champions in every single division, and we find that the grassroots organizing in climate is fierce. And so that has made an enormous difference with our Green Buildings program. We have a 100% EV goal. We're the first company to do that in beauty. So the will is definitely there. I think the job of the sustainability team is to simplify. Also, honestly, the fact that the standards keep changing, that the measures keep changing, that we still don't have terminology really for the CSRD on certain things. So I think what government can do to help us is clarify terms, speed up permitting, but also I would say make sure that the climate teams and the teams can be on the balls of their feet, making proactive pro-climate decisions and not really on their heels trying to comply with regulations that are hard to understand.
Yeah, so maybe just real quick, I know we're short on time, but specifically for driving down scope 3 across the decision makers and influences in your company, as Nancy mentioned earlier, like good, strict, disciplined requirements management helps a ton. So if you have certain footprint or other environmental requirements in your products, those percolate down to engineering, procurement, financial data analytics, et cetera. So that helps. Also, internal gamification helps. Like we have a engine manufacturing customer who had a lightweighting game and a calculator that they could use. So as designers, as well as procurement and other folks would take weight out of the engines, they could understand like how many, on average, F-150 trucks did that take off the road for their life. So people could go home, feel good about themselves, say, hey, look, I made a decision today that took 1,000 trucks off the road for their lifetime because I took this much weight out of this engine that's going to be in 1 million different trucks, those sorts of things. So a little bit of gamification, but also the requirements linking discipline helps a lot.
All right, I think we're at time, but I just want to say thank you to our panelists. Thank you for the audience questions, but really hugely insightful discussion. Bring everyone with you. Like you said, don't let perfect be the enemy of good. And also just, thank you for sharing those fabulous examples. And we will see you soon. Thank you.
Great job. Thank you very much.